Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 20th Science Café. Thank you for joining us. Science Café is jointly organized by the Czech Center Brussels and the representation of Southern Moravia to the EU with the support of the Embassy of the Czech Republic to the Kingdom of Belgium. Due to the pandemic, we broadcast today from the Southern Moravian region. My name is Pavlína Pancová-Šimková and I am your host. Science Café is an open forum where members of the public can meet distinguished scientists and discuss topical issues. It is not a formal lecture or panel debate, but opportunity for everyone to ask questions and express their opinion. There is no stupid question. We want to make sure that we address your most emerging queries and concerns about today's topic. Therefore, you can ask your questions on all platforms that we broadcast. It is my pleasure to welcome Miroslav Trnka from the Global Change Research Institute, Czech Academy of Science. Professor Trnka has dedicated his scientific career to investigating the impact of climate change. His research has focused on drought climatology and methods of drought assessment and monitoring. Professor Trnka is also a founding member of the INTERSUCHO team and a unique tool for displaying drought intensity in the Central Europe. Also, since senior position at the Czech Global Change Research Institute and also a position at the Mendel University in Brno. With Professor Trnka and you, we will mainly focus on drought. A recently published article by Nature Geoscience, which Professor Trnka co-authored, states that the climate reconstruction demonstrates a sequence of recent European summer droughts since 2015, which are unprecedented in the past 2,110 years. By 2050, the exposure of South and West European grassland to increasing heath and drought is likely to double. Last week, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction published a special report on drought 2021. UN Secretary Special Representative for Disaster Risk said, drought is on the verge of becoming the next pandemic. There is no vaccine to cure it. Most of the world will be living with water stress in the next few years. And that's space for my first question. What is the scientific response to the UN Secretary's statement? Is water shortage the new normal? Professor Trnka, floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Good evening. That's a good question. I think it really comes to a point where on the Earth we are really talking. If we would be in tropics, or would be in the very north of the northern hemisphere, then we don't think that water is going to be less sort of available or more scarce than today. Perhaps on the contrary. On the other hand, in the sort of temperate regions, that's much more for the question. That's the area where the models are, in general, more uncertain. If you look at the climate change projections, most climate models agree that we get, on average, increase of precipitation in tropics and in some parts of subtropics, and we get an increase in the northern hemisphere in a very much sort of north of 55th parallel. So let's say Northern Europe, Canada, etc. On the other hand, when you look at the belt between these two, that's much less certain what's going to happen. There are big regional differences. That's the general trend. And the second thing is much more concerning. That comes with the warming. We get atmosphere that is much more efficient in taking water out of the vegetation. In simple terms, landscape will need more water to sustain, let's say, the current runoff levels under the higher temperatures. And it basically expands the area where we have, let's say, potentially lack of water, at least for some part of the year. And that comes on top of the growing population and growing demand for water. So we have combined two things. One is not a natural, but let's say an increase in human population and human consumption. And in many areas, we have climate stress that increases, let's say, probability of water shortages that are climatically induced. And when this comes together, that it can create a almost insurmountable problem, because with pandemic you can always find a treatment, you can sooner or later have a vaccine. For drought you need only water to remedy it, but there are areas and quantities of water that you just cannot move. So it becomes both a security issue, it becomes a food security issue. It is a major it's a thing of major concern, and I have no doubt that UN is trying to work around it, and in the same time knowing the UN and how it works and what are their sort of abilities, okay, and let's say resources. It's not a fight they can win themselves. So it's going to have to be solved in much broader consensus of not only UN but individual states, groups of states like European Union, and globally, because it comes at the end as the risk for everyone.
In that context, and you already touched upon that, can it actually lead to the disintegration of our societies as we know them? I mean, is our way of life a sustainable project, or is there you mentioned that there is a need for a change, but how big that change needs to be to actually achieve the sustainability?
Again, that's a tough question, and I'm not expert on let's say the social aspects of drought and socioeconomic aspect of drought. I've only come across it occasionally. The things I know, at least from Europe and for Europe, we are pretty efficient with the way we use water. Yes, we can increase our efficiency. It will come with a cost, but that's certainly technically doable. And talking about the Czech Republic, yes, we have a very low consumption per capita, but still there is room for improvement. But it's going to be it would be costly. Still, on the other hand, in Europe, average consumption is over 100 liters per head daily, which is far more than in many other countries. And if you think about sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or some areas in the Indian subcontinent or Middle East, there the water sort of scarcity issue is even bigger, and the population pressure is much higher. So, and also dependency on agriculture is also much higher. So if we think what activity consumes the most water, it's not the humans themselves, it's usually the agriculture. In this respect, let's say Central Europe is not typical, because we are certainly not consuming water for agriculture too much. But Southern Europe, most of the arid region or semi-arid region, dry subtropics, that's typically area where you need irrigation to obtain sufficient harvest. And here, the future pressures are going to be much higher than are today. And again, there are solutions, but even without climate change, we would have trouble to sustain the consumption of water in many areas, in many aquifers, especially for underground water. With climate change, this becomes far more pressing issue, and basically climate change robs us of time that we would otherwise have to adapt and adjust. So it is a double threat, and we have to deal with it. And I think it sort of comes. That's the reason why water frequently comes in a debate as a thing of concern, potential cause for a war, simply because it is a resource without which it's very difficult for many societies to sort of imagine sort of habiting a certain area.
You mentioned that there are solutions. So therefore, I would like to pick up on that and ask you, if there are solutions, what would be your advice for farmers? What would be your advice for policymakers? What are these solutions?
Well, again, the solutions are locally specific. The one thing that frequently gets hidden is that we have a huge water trade. That's the reason why our colleagues, especially from Netherlands, when they come with the water footprint initiative or water accounting, they were pointing to the fact that yes, there is a huge trade and shift of water resources through food commodities between regions. And in many ways, it makes sense that you are transporting a food from areas where you have enough water and you can grow the food there, and you transport it to areas where there's less water. But what comes from this analysis frequently is that you sometimes have areas that don't have much water, and the water is a scarce resource. And you are transporting it to areas that are much better off in terms of water. So it sort of gives you a perspective, and that's one thing that should be addressed. The second, for policymakers, I think certainly look at the science and look at the independent and large, broadly based scientific evidence. Not at, let's say, a particular study, but again for panel of experts that you can trust and that can lead, because even the experts will not know the answers immediately. It is an iterative process. For the farming, it really depends at the area where you are farming. If you are farmer in the Czech Republic, well, there is not much hope you will get irrigation water because we don't have much of it. And water we have is going to have to be used very sort of scarcely. And there is a big temptation, not only in Czech Republic, but in other regions, to somehow sort of bypass it, sort of to use underground water resources, and this is totally unsustainable usually. So I know the situation in Ogallala Aquifer in US, which supports a huge area for the farming in the United States. And unfortunately, there is not much agreement how to use the aquifer and how much water is there. And what happens is that the water is slowly going down, which shows that the more water is extracted than is being sort of renewed. And this is unsustainable. And we are talking about the wealthy nations that could probably live without this production. And if you look at many areas in Middle East and, for example, India, if you extract too much water, you get a point where you have no water, then there are huge consequences with that. And I would advise both to the farmers and the policymakers that we have to be sort of mindful that, especially with water and underground water especially, but also with the surface resources, it is not an incremental problem. It comes to a point where there is simply not enough water. And then it's abrupt change with many sort of unwanted consequences. And you cannot transport water for irrigation over the long distances, or as many projects around the world teach us, not without risk. So one should always sort of accommodate the local production to the local climate potential and the local water resources. And if you do something outside of these limits, that has to be funded by water from somewhere. And you have to always be sure that this is sustainable, or should be sure that this is sustainable. Otherwise, you will waste the money at the end.
Well, that was a very broad answer, and thank you for that. On that topic, I would like to come back to the Central Europe, as we are experiencing for several years a major forest dieback. There are several debates or opinions. What is the reason behind the dieback? Do you think it's also the water, because there is simply not enough water in the forest in the Central Europe?
No, I mean it's not $1 million question. It's basically a very simple one. If you look at the three species, we are seeing a dieback. It is coming for species that are primarily grown in higher elevation than we are growing them today for number of generations. And it must be said, is for over almost 300 years, we've been successfully farming the forests in that would otherwise grown only in the mountains in areas 400, 500, 600 meters above the sea level, achieving quite incredible production, basically. And having a sort of forests that are full of timber that is high quality, easily extractable, and also the forestry system was supporting itself. So it was economical, it was efficient, it was a way to use the part of the landscape and provide number of services. But from 1990s, colleagues of mine at the institute, I mean, the current sort of management of our institute in that time, basically 25 years ago, based on the first studies of climate change impacts, warned that for the spruce and pine, the climate change will mean severe problems, likely decline, and it is advisable to sort of turn the typical or traditional forestry to something else. And it has been slowly coming. It was not ignored totally, not at all. I mean, there has been efforts, but these efforts sort of were too slow, and basically a climate change was coming too fast. It is very hard for a system that basically has a 100-year turnover to turn itself within 20 years without a major push. So my suspicion, I mean, this is a typical way of society approaching these problems. You have a scientist that are giving a warning, but society gets many warnings. And usually after the first or second event that sort of confirms the warning, then you have some action. Here with the forest, I would have to be fair, there was more efforts to sort of improve the forest health and change the management before the dieback, because the evidence was there, but it was not on the scale that would be needed to prevent it. And to your questions, yes, definitely the drought or the sort of disbalance in the water availability was the major cause of dieback. The bark beetle infestation, that was just a follow-up. That was sort of increased by other factors. But we can see a similar situation not only in Czech Republic, but also in neighboring countries, perhaps not on the level that we are seeing it here. But it is certainly concerning, and it is a major change. It's the largest change in the forest, certainly in my generation, I've ever witnessed. And unfortunately, it is likely to continue.
Well, likely to continue is not positive to hear, but maybe we will now turn to something more positive. One of your topics when it comes to scientific work is modeling. So I came across one of the most quoted articles that you co-authored, which is called The Comparison of Ceres, Vodfrost, and Swap Models in Simulating Soil Water Content During the Growing Season Under Different Soil Conditions. Now, could you, more in the layman terms, explain what this particular research was about and what is the difference and why we actually need a different models?
Okay, I would almost say it was a paper from my youth naivety with my then informal PhD supervisor. It was a great work in terms of having fun doing it. What we were trying to do, there was a big experiment, and still is, in Austria, where they measure very meticulously soil moisture and number of depths for 3 different soil profiles in incredible number of replicates. So there's a very, very good database that allows for testing various models. And we basically had a question. I mean, if you have this very complex behavior of water seeping into the soil, because it's certainly not trivial. We always try to understand what water does in a soil, and we can't simply look underneath it and watch it. So the easiest way is to model it. And therefore, we are using different modeling types or model types. And we showed that we basically took 3 different models, from very simple one to very complex one. And we shown that you don't need the most sophisticated model, that sort of a medium complex model is just enough to give you enough answers. And the second thing was that if you try to really understand, or if you want to model a soil water movement in the very high detail, then you need so much of data that you can do it only in very few places. So basically, for me, it was one of the key papers in terms of understanding the things I'm doing, because I realized, okay, it is important to choose the model of right complexity for your data. And that was the biggest lecture for me. And it is a general lecture. So if you try to model something, yes, one thing is to have a very nice and complex and inclusive model. But then the next thought should be, or perhaps even the first thought, what data you have to feed the model. If you don't have a good enough data, then it doesn't make sense to make a super detailed model that you have to estimate most of your parameters anyway. So that was, I hope, in simple terms, what we were doing in the time.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned databases. You mentioned need of the high amount of the data. Open science, and especially open data, are highly debated on various levels within the EU, member states, national systems, programs, institutes. So what is your opinion about this European research policy?
Well, first, it always comes with the tricks. So first of all, when we do a research in a public domain for the public fund, with the public funds, I believe the data should be made available. So if I write an article, the underlying data that I used ideally should be published as a, for example, separate database or paper. So first of all, you get a citable credit for it, and anyone who follows can use the data. So that's the perfect model. Then, of course, it becomes more complicated. I mean, the biggest concern I have, I mean, our group or our institute, we spent quite a bit of manpower and resources on determining and conducting experiments, because most of our models are based on experiments. But it's far easier, I sort of beg all the modelers in the audience for forgiving me, that it's far easier to model something than to do the good experiment. And as doing both, I can that's my personal experience. It takes you usually several years to do a good experiment. It takes you several months to do a good modeling exercise. And in many cases, we see there is a disparity. I mean, since we have the scientific evaluation and science evaluation based on number of citations on the Hirsch index or whatever scientometry tool, which is fine. But this inherently puts off many experimentalists. And we have institutions that have a huge amount of experimental data, and they don't feel they get a credit if they share it with researchers. And I think that's one of the biggest issues. I mean, we try to overcome it in our group by actively involving all the experimentalists in the writing team, for example. But sometimes it's very difficult because, I mean, the experiments include a number of people, and you just have the list like from a telephone book. If you try to include everyone, so it's not a solution that would work everywhere. But my worry is that if one press from one side just to open all the data without a merit or credit given to those that are providing the data in a sufficient and visible way, at the end, everyone will lose because there will not be enough people working on the data side. That's just a simple observation I have. And you create basically a divide between the people who publish based on the open data and those that should sort of feed in and are expected to sort of provide the open data. And they are hesitant and resistant to do it many times. So, I mean, it is, I think it's a good direction, but we have to make it in evolution steps. That's my major advice, because I've been working with US agencies. They have the open data policy. It's possible to get data for almost for anything, at least in the climate science. But the data quality you get, that's sometimes really appalling. I mean, there you would be surprised. Compare what you get for paid service in European countries. That, at least on the climate field, there's a big difference. And I'm not saying that, I mean, for me, at least within Czech Republic and Central European context, collaboration with data providers like CzechMed Institute has been tricky. But after years, we established some sort of stable relationship and predictable relationship. And then you can operate. You don't actually, I mean, the open data, it's always a question what it means. But the open data don't come for free. That's one thing. And you need a people to get a credit for providing open data. So I'm very much for the open data, but I also see the inherent risk that it's much easier to analyze the data than to gather them. And therefore, most people would find a fast track by sort of collecting data, not collecting data, but using the data without sort of inputting their, for example, products to the open databases. So that's quite tricky, and I sort of keep fingers crossed that we get through this, so let's say with flying colors, and we don't suffer too much, because it's not easy. It's certainly not an easy question, and in climatology, medical research, biochemistry, I mean, there is always a very fine line we have to walk, sort of not endangering data collection by sort of pressing too hard. On the other hand, making sure that the rules are fair to everyone, both to the data users and the data providers.
Thank you. Now, I would like to return to the Czech Republic, because you are one of the founders of the INTERSUCHO project, which monitors drought in the Czech Republic and also in some parts of the Central Europe. So are there similar projects, programs elsewhere, or is it your way of dealing with that and publishing it regularly each week on the website unique?
Oh, not really. It has the model. We have to be. We confess to have friends in the United States that started a US drought monitor during a 1995 drought, and it has been working ever since. So they are operating more than 25 years. And we worked with the colleagues at the University of Nebraska for many years, since 2000, basically, starting with a NATO project that was really focused on collaboration between US and sort of Czech on the drought and drought security. And we had a vision that we would like to have a system that would be somewhat similar, but a bit different, a bit so we put some of our imagination into it. And it took quite a bit of time to get funds, to get people around it. And it became more like a rallying point, I would say, for scientists within the community we are working with. So we can, on the one hand, obtain new data and new sort of ways of looking at data, because we have to present it. We get a feedback from our reporters, which is unique, because we get a direct every week check by hundreds of farmers that provide us with feedback on agriculture drought. But in the same time, we are able to collaborate with Czech Hydromet Institute, with Water Research Institute, as a partners that can sort of provide additional information to data that they already have. So it has been a learning process for everyone. And yeah, and it's not unique. We We do it also for Slovakia. We collaborated on similar system for Austria. I know Poland and Germany have a system that tries to monitor it. I have to say that, I mean, INTERSUCHO, INTERDROUGHT sort of approaches, it might be a bit different because we are academic institution and we can do things very quickly. If we decide that something is worth of trying, we can do it within months. And we don't have to sort of, ask anyone for permission to do it, which is a great advantage. And we can test many things that are hard to test. For example, in the US, where you have a big responsibility because many big decisions depend on it. INTERSUCHO or INTERDROUGHT is very useful. It has been used for a number of decisions in the recent droughts, but on the other hand, we are quite independent. So that's the difference. That's maybe a specialty of the system. On the other hand, we are very closely working with the stakeholders and people that are using it. So we are mindful what people expect, but we are certainly not serving primarily to anyone. So that's one of the differences that we see.
In terms to the relation of terminating to the target group community into the public policymakers, Sky News features a daily climate show, which for me was a little bit surprising to find out about. So do you think that for getting public even more interest in the issue and more aware of the issue would be worth to have a similar show also in the region, or let's say at least in the European Union to again target the attention?
Well, maybe, yeah. Certainly, it is not surprising. I mean, in the US, there is a weather channel that runs for, I think, 30 years now. So there is a special station that only focuses on weather, and everyone talks about it. And within that, they have a climate show too. So it's not new. For Europe or Central Europe, yes, I think it would be helpful to sort of spread the message and try to educate people in understanding to the climate system and the weather patterns, weather extremes. I think it's more important than before. We travel a lot. That's what when I'm teaching students about extreme, I say, well, you never experience hurricane within Europe, but you have to know about it. Because you may be as a tourist, you may be as a professional in the area where the hurricane is coming, and you might have an idea to sort of weather it or live through it. And I try to explain that it's not a good idea. That's similar. It is not a thing from a movies, and nobody is going to come to your rescue because it's impossible. So we have to educate ourselves, and we should educate people simply because we will come through risks because of climate change that we haven't seen, but we can experience them in other countries. And in the same time, we have a lot of tourists going to areas which are hurricane prone, floods prone, and having a basic conscience and understanding how you behave and how the weather system can develop, and appreciate that in tropics, weather is very different to Central or Southern Europe. That's important knowledge in this global world. And yes, I definitely think we should work on this.
In that context, there is a quote by John Steinbeck. It comes from his novel, East to the Eden. And he stated there that during the wet years, they lost all memory of the dry years. Do you think that we have a similar issue when it comes to when it comes to the general public and sometimes to the policymakers? So, because this year we are experiencing in the Czech Republic, let's say, more water, more rain than in previous years. Will it also happen that we actually forget that we will fulfill the Steinbeck's quote, "We forgot about the dry years"?
Unfortunately, that's a typical way of sort of dealing with drought. Floods hurricanes, tornadoes have one advantage. They cause a structural damage that is immediate, and it basically imprints within the community because of the suffering and the damage and the losses the community suffers. So the good thing that comes from the bad is that the community usually tries to be better prepared for the next one. With drought, there is usually no structural damage unless there is a fire. And the dieback is of the community usually is slow, and it's difficult to see in the first place. It also causes a big sort of decrease in the revenues that are coming. If you have floods, for example, in the area, usually, especially in the Europe or US, much of the property is insured. So you basically immediately after the emergency have available funds that you can use. And in many cases, the floods actually don't lead to the decrease of the gross domestic product, but it levels off or sometimes even slightly increases because of investment that comes on top of the flood. If you have drought that lasts several years and you cannot do anything during a drought to prepare or improve your ability to resist, that's basically usually a very negative impact on the economic performance of that country. But surprisingly, this is very much forget, as you say, when the rain comes. And a colleague of mine, Professor Wilhite from US, put it in a phrase that he calls a hydrological cycle. So you have a panic during a drought, and everyone would sort of approve any option that he could get hands on, build a new reservoir, build a new dam. But it doesn't make sense if you are in drought because there's no water to fill it. But when this ends and you should be doing these things, well, there are other pressing issues of a day and it gets buried. So it is not a case of only our society. We know it from previous society, from Central America, from Middle East, which were stricken by long periods of drought, that they also forget about drought. And to be fair, if the drought never really affected the regions in such severe way, it's hard to blame them. And for Czech Republic specifically, I mean, we had a drought that was one of the worst we could see in terms of in climate parameters. But because of many things that happened in the past, due to the construction of dams after the drought in 1947 and decline of the consumption after the 1989, we have been sort of lucky to have enough resources to basically weather a 5-year drought. If similar drought would come to California with a similar intensity, not sort of absolute terms, but meaning sort of relatively, the drought of this type, we would see much bigger disruptions. And again, I mean, the drought, which was quite severe, didn't cause the damage that would be irreplaceable. But if we would have consumption of water like we had in 1990, and the drought of 2018 hit us, or 2015 to 2019, I mean, we would be without water very likely after 1.5 or 2 years in many regions, not entirely, but there would be much bigger, the water would be much bigger issue than it was today, so on last years. So it is always a question when it comes. And I would frankly say, yes, we were partly lucky, partly it was a preparedness based on the experience of the past generations, and also just a coincidence that just because of the economy and economical changes, we greatly reduced the water consumption compared what the infrastructure was prepared for. So just put it in perspective. According to plans from 1980s, I think the targeted level of water availability or water consumption was about 240 liters per capita. And we currently have about 100. So you have a huge reserve from the projection of the infrastructure that has been done years back. And despite the climate change and despite the drought, the infrastructure still held together in many cases just surprisingly well. In some areas, we get to a point where local politicians and local water managers were quite concerned, but it never sort of gets to a point where it would be unmanageable. But yeah, if you add 3 more years of such drought, that would not be enough. And again, that's quite important to always realize this. We managed the episode quite well, and we have to analyze why that was the case, and we have to understand it. And also, I have to say, when we did the analysis of drought of last 5 years, and when we project the droughts that we have in the future, towards the end of the century, this would be much more a regular event rather than exception. So imagine that we can be pushed much more outside the envelope for which the infrastructure has been made ready in mid-20th century, where water was relatively ample and we had good rains almost entire year and droughts were scarce. So that would be my answer.
You mentioned that your recent analysis, the analysis of the 5-year drought, in that term, which scientific questions are you the most eager to answer? What is the question for you, the $1 million question?
I mean, the question, I always try to work on things I'm doing just right now. But if I would like to understand something, that would be a probability and forecastability of drought. So really understand a drought globally rather than on a regional level. Try to understand how droughts and wet events are connected in order to be able to estimate better the patterns. That's for me. I mean, even though a climate system is a chaotic one and long-term predictions are very difficult or impossible, basically, by definition, drought is slightly different in this sense. It works on different time scale. Still, it's chaotic. But I believe we can significantly improve our ability to forecast drought events, meaning globally, not just for the local area. And given the importance of drought, I think that's the burning question I have in my mind, sort of trying to understand that.
Well, then hopefully one day you will manage your answer. I have a slightly very different question, which is connected to one of your interviews. Because while studying for this discussion or debate, I came across your very short note in the Swedish national television on the topic of 500-year drought in the Czech Republic. And I was so little bit surprised, and I would say more than a little surprised, how it happens that the Czech drought actually gets into the Swedish national television.
I think the story is quite simple because we made an interview for the Czech National Press Agency, and the editor found it interesting, so he let it translated to English, and then the Swedish television came across it, and it just fitted into their schedule. One of the reasons why Swedish television was interested in it, they lived through a major drought. I think it was 2018 with a number of forest fires. And they were interested in droughts in other parts of the Europe. And again, I mean, our research also shows that Europe itself, when it's affected by drought, it tends to be, recent droughts were more like a dipole. You have areas in Europe, let's say West Central, that are in drought, and you have Southeast that is wetter than usual, or the other way around. So it is important for everyone to see what other sort of neighbors are doing. And of course, it is, especially with the Swedish experience, I believe the fire experience was pretty bad one. Not because of damage or the injuries or lives lost. Fortunately, there were none lost, as far as I know, but because of the air quality issues. And that's other aspect of drought, that if you have drought, you usually get increased air pollution. If you have more fires, the air quality gets really dampened. So at the end, drought can have a multiple cascading effects through things one would never imagine would be related to drought. So, and because of the long-term transport and sort of the connected world, we should be interested and worried about drought. Not worried, but interested and understand the drought consequences in our neighborhood, in neighboring continents, especially Africa, especially Asia, Middle East, but also in the US, Australia, because it has consequences for us as a group, as a sort of group of nations, because we are sort of part of that economic system. And drought is certainly one of the biggest potential disruptions or disruptors in the system.
Okay, well, droughts as a major disruption system. There is also a question which came through the chat, and there's a question whether we can expect the changes also to appear in the food supply, whether actually the agriculture is going to be infected so much as I would read that question, be affected by drought so much that there has to be a changes in the food supply.
No, it's a good question. I mean, that's been something I've been working on with my colleagues for several years. We had a recent paper in Science Advances 2 years ago where we really tried to sort of look at this question specifically. We took wheat as a crop that is grown mostly without irrigation. Wheat is primarily grown everywhere, almost, where we have agriculture. Surprisingly, it is not the most important crop. I think it's the second or third, depending on which year. But it is the most important crop in terms of the calories, and especially in terms of calories transported. So if you think about transporting calories from one region to other, usually the wheat is the primary tool to be used and a primary commodity. And we made a relatively simple analysis. We made a global drought indicator, and we looked what happened with the prices when we compare the area affected by drought and the wheat prices. And if you looked only at the area that was used as the arable land, so entire arable land, we got some relationship. So more drought, higher prices, put simply. If we took only the area, weighted it by the amount of wheat that is grown on it, the relationship get much tighter. And when we took only 10 exporting countries, the top 10 exporting countries, we were able to explain much of the 2008, 2009 price hike. Surprisingly, and it's well known, there was not much effect on the production itself, at least based on the data we have available through the public sort of FAO databases. So, I mean, there's some debate about the truthfulness in some of these data. So, but what we did then was we looked, okay, we have a drought today that are able to cause a major price hikes, mainly because some governments get really nervous, and based on the sort of public pressure, they, for example, stop exports. And then the rest of the market have to do something with it. And if you make your market smaller, you give more power to the speculations. So you can have a price hike very easily. Interestingly, sort of these droughts rarely affect more than 10 to 15% of area. On the worst years, if you take a 3 years window, within 3 years, there is less than 15% area of the global wheat growing regions affected by drought. That would be severe enough to be a concern. Interestingly, this still provides a price hikes, not a disruption of a production. The explanation is if you have a drought somewhere, you usually have a better condition somewhere else. So it evens out. But when we take the same approach and look into the climate projection, even when we take the most ambitious climate change mitigation policy, the so-called RCP 2.6, that would pretty much follow the Paris Accord, and we would keep the warming below 2 degrees, we still would expect that the area affected by drought over this 3-year window would double or triple by 2050. So that's a major concern, because that never happened over past 100 years. By 2050, it's going to be at least 9 billion people on the planet. So 25% more, about 1/5 more than there is today, likely wanting to eat at least the same quality or better quality food. And we have a higher chance of droughts occurring sort of simultaneously. So for me, this is one of the, I've talked about it, that this is a question I want to understand, because this is concerning. We have agriculture focused in, it is distributed, but when you look where are the most productive regions, there are not too many. And they are mostly in the drought-prone regions, or any region is basically drought-prone. So yes, it is a matter of concern, and that's one of the things we should be concerned about. Surprisingly, when you look at the complex models that are trying to estimate what the food production is going to be, the answer is, we should not be too much concerned, because if we do a proper adaptation, and if we increase the productivity, we should still be fine. The major issue is that all these models expect and stress that it's very important to keep the markets open when you are in drought. So you allow the markets to sort of shift the production and the supply where the demand is, and optimize it by itself. And any disruption that is done sort of by the national governments based on the self-interest usually hurts everyone at the end. That's one of the messages that's come from from colleagues that are working with these complex models, for example, at the ALSA in Luxembourg, and that's very clear. But it's very difficult to sell to the public and to the policymakers, because if you remember drought in 2010 in Russia and India, one of the first and very popular measure was we close the exports, we shut the exports. And that was the primary cause for the price hike. Not the only one. The drought was still the sort of driving factor. But what we did with the information, that's important. And you can make a sort of a fire much worse if you put a gasoline on it.
Well, you mentioned concerns, difficulties. You mentioned constraints to communicate the drought to the public, and the messages which are connected to the response of the society. Is there a positive side in terms of, let's say, a higher quality or higher price products being grown elsewhere or being findable elsewhere, or is there just the negative side? Can we actually mention something positive?
I think the drought is something we always have had to work with as a any farming community was to smaller or bigger extent faced with drought. There are very few agricultural regions that haven't experienced drought. So I always see, yes, there are opportunities, but I think if you look at the global agriculture system as such, as sort of in its complex, it sort of makes you think that it is an opportunity. I mean, if we have this, let's say, almost a drought pandemic that might be coming, if the globe is facing it together, we have a good chance of sort of weathering it. But it also requires sort of forward thinking. For example, in Europe, Europe is known to have a surplus of sort of productive capacity. And if we sort of think only about the services for European citizens that the region or the landscape is allowing us, and water we have, then yes, we can greatly improve the quality of life of citizens, which is, of course, the primary concern of the governments. But we should be also mindful that changes happening elsewhere, and ability to sort of maintain sort of a positive effect on, for example, global food markets. I mean, and it comes with a big responsibility. I see we as basically Europeans have a big responsibility on, we have the ability to produce more food than we need. And you need to have a redundancy in the system. In Europe, we pay for the agriculture policy quite big part of the budget. And overproduction, that is frequently mentioned, that's the downside of it, or it's seen as a big downside. But if you take it globally, and if you would think that every nation would sort of get rid of the surplus, get rid of the redundancy, and just optimize it perfectly, so you sort of balance the production perfectly with all of the other services, and you don't have any reserve in the system. Well, just think about the COVID-19 pandemic. How sort of lucky or happy were we in the Czech Republic, especially, that we have relatively high number of emergency beds in the hospitals. That is not used for most of the time, but that was the time when it was needed. It was used up to the limit, and that was the case of most of the countries. So if you think about the health system as being a black hole where you can invest sort of huge amount of money, well, without it, it would look like a medieval times without any cure and any hope for most of the severely sort of sick people. And we should take that as a lesson, that when we think about the system, the efficiency is one thing and the redundancy is important. It is part, it is not efficient, but you have to also look at a system that is enough redundant so you can survive the episodes of, for example, drought, but it could be other problems that will be associated with climate change, not only drought, like heat waves, frost. So more diverse, enough reserve built in, that's a hope. I don't think it also provides Europe with a unique soft tool for diplomacy and positively influencing the world around us. So it gives us some sort of leverage with many of the countries, and will give us a leverage for the future. And we should sort of be mindful of it and not give it up, easily, or think about it when we are sort of looking at other uses of the landscape.
Well, with that hope, I would like to thank you for today's debate and for joining us for the Science Cafe. And I also would like to wish you good luck and in your future research. And hopefully once you will be able to answer your question. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.